To understand the most influential book in history, we must look not just at what remains, but at what was removed. By analyzing the exclusion of the Apocrypha through the lens of strategic gatekeeping and social inclusion, we uncover the ultimate masterclass in high-stakes narrative control and the resilience of forbidden wisdom. Forget the stained glass stillness for a moment. To understand the man who split history in two, we must first look at the dirt under his fingernails. In the dust of first-century Palestine, crushed beneath the iron heel of the Fry, a peasant artisan, emerged not merely as a religious figure, but as a systemic threat. Historical forensics suggest Jesus of Nazareth wasn't just wandering, he was targeting. Some scholarship, cross-referencing the Essene scrolls of Qumran with the cryptic sayings in the Gnostic, posits a radical hypothesis, that his ministry was a calculated insurgency of the mind. He spoke Aramaic, the language of the working class, specifically to bypass the elite Latin of the occupier and the legalistic Hebrew of the Sanhedrin. He wasn't accidentally killed, he was executed for sedition. This wasn't just faith, it was high-stakes strategic thinking. The lesson for us isn't just spiritual, it is about the sheer power to dismantle an empire. How do you disrupt an unbeatable opponent? You don't outfight them, you outthink them. Imagine standing on the edge of the Judean wilderness. The heat is oppressive, the landscape is unforgiving, and the year is roughly 30 CE. To the west, the marble columns of the empire project the power of the peace of Rome. But let's be clear, this was a peace enforced by the sword, a stability bought with the suppression of local identity. For a Jewish artisan in Galilee, the atmosphere wasn't peaceful. It was a powder keg of political resentment and apocalyptic expectation. To truly understand Jesus of Nazareth, not just as a religious icon, but as a historical disruptor and a master of influence, we have to look at the forensic evidence beneath our feet. We have to look at what was hidden in the caves. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd threw a rock into a cave at Qumran and shattered a clay jar, revealing the Dead Sea Scrolls. These texts, written by a sect called the Essenes, give us the baseline frequency of the era. The people at Qumran dealt with the corruption of their time by withdrawing. They chose isolation. They waited for a cosmic war to cleanse the world. This is crucial context because it highlights Jesus' strategic differentiation. Unlike the Essenes, he didn't withdraw to the desert to hide. He went there to prepare, and then he marched directly back into the chaos of the marketplace. This brings us to our first principle of leadership. True resilience isn't aiding the stressful environment. It is metabolizing the stress and returning to the center of conflict with a clear head. But the historical record gets even more complex. In 1945, in Upper Egypt, another discovery was made at Nag Hammadi, the Gnostic Gospels. Texts like the Gospel of Thomas offer a different, often controversial lens. Gnosticism, derived from the Greek meaning knowledge, emphasized an inner, esoteric insight rather than public dogma. While the canonical Gospels focus on the of his life and death, these texts often present Jesus as a dispenser of wisdom, speaking in riddles and koans, designed to shock the mind into a higher state of awareness. Why does this matter to us today? Because it reveals Jesus as a radical thinker who understood that information alone doesn't change people. Insight does. Whether you view the Gnostic texts as heretical or historical curiosities, they confirm that his teaching style was Socratic, disruptive, and deeply psychological. He didn't just give orders, he forced his listeners to do the heavy lifting of interpretation. This creates a bridge to Jesus operated in a high-stakes environment where one wrong word could lead to execution by the Romans or condemnation by the Sanhedrin, the supreme religious council of the time. Speaking Aramaic, the earthy language of the common people, he utilized parables to bypass the defense mechanisms of his listeners. When asked a trap question, he rarely answered directly. He answered with a story or another question. In negotiation theory, we call this reframing. He shifted the power dynamic from the interrogator back to the audience. He made the listener an active participant in the discovery of truth. Consider the forensic reality of his network. The Sanhedrin maintained power through exclusion, keeping the clean separate from the unclean. Jesus practiced radical. He built a core team that made no sense on paper. Fishermen, political zealots, and tax collectors who were viewed as collaborators with the Roman occupier. In a modern corporate sense, this is the ultimate diverse team. He understood that innovation doesn't come from echo chambers. It comes from the friction of differing worldviews united by a singular purpose. He leveraged high to navigate these tensions, creating loyalty not through transaction, but through transformation. Finally, we have to talk about the cost of. The historical Jesus walked a path that inevitably put him on a collision course with the power structures of Jerusalem. The Gnostic texts and the canonical accounts agree on one thing. He refused to compromise his message for safety. He possessed a terrifying level of alignment between his internal values and his external actions. When we strip away the millennia of tradition and look at the texts, from the caves of Qumran to the sands of Egypt, we see a figure who mastered the art of communication. He understood that to lead is to disturb the comfortable. He showed us that the most effective way to change a culture isn't to attack it from the outside, but to walk into the center of it, speak the language of the people, and live out a counter so compelling that it becomes impossible to ignore. That is not just history. That is the blueprint for influence. Let's strip away the stained glass and the centuries of dogma for a moment. To understand Jesus of Nazareth, we have to perform a forensic analysis of the first century. We need to step onto the dusty, sun-baked roads of Galilee, a region crushed under the iron boot of the Pax Romana. This wasn't a time of peace. It was a time of peace through force. If you stepped out of line, you were nailed to a tree. In this high-pressure cooker, you had the Jewish elite, the Sanhedrin, trying to maintain a delicate political homeostasis with Rome. You had the Zealots wanting to burn it all down. And you had the ascetics at Qumran, the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls, who believed the only solution was to retreat into the desert and wait for the apocalypse. Then you have Jesus. He doesn't pick up a sword. He doesn't hide in a cave. He walks right into the market. He engages. And he deuces a mode of thinking so radical that it disrupted the operating system of the Western world. He wasn't just a spiritual figure. He was a master logician and a strategic disruptor. Consider the landscape of his communication. Most leaders in antiquity led through fear or transaction. Jesus led through what we might call cognitive reframing. He didn't just tell people what to do, he changed how they viewed reality. Let's look at the data. The historical Jesus spoke Aramaic, a language of earth and commerce. When he spoke, he used the mashal, the parable. But don't mistake these for simple bedtime stories. A parable is a riddle. It's a mechanism designed to bypass your defense mechanisms. When the Pharisees or the legal experts tried to trap him, they used binary logic. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? It's a gotcha question. If he says yes, the people hate him. If he says no, Rome executes him. This is where we see his intellect at work. He doesn't answer the binary. He asks for a coin. He asks, "Whose image is this?" They say, "Caesar's." He says, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's." He creates a third category. He separates the political from the spiritual, effectively neutralizing the trap while asserting a higher allegiance. This is supreme strategic thinking. In your own life, when you are backed into a corner by a binary choice, this or that, win or lose, you have to look for the third option. The most resilient leaders don't accept the premise of a rigged question. They redefine the context. That is the essence of strategic autonomy. Now, let's talk about his platform. In the ancient world, and frankly in our world, value is determined by hierarchy. The closer you are to the center of power, the emperor, the high priest, the more you matter. Jesus inverted the pyramid. This wasn't just being nice. It was a calculated dismantling of social stratification. He ate with tax collectors, who were viewed as collaborators with the Roman occupation. He spoke with women in public, which was culturally taboo. He touched lepers, violating the strictest codes of ritual purity. Why? Was it just compassion? Yes, but it was also a strategy of radical social inclusion. He was building a coalition of the marginalized. He understood that true loyalty isn't bought. It is forged by giving dignity to those who have been denied it. Here is the practical wisdom: integrity. In a corporate environment or a community, we often curate our circles based on status. We network up. Jesus networked down and out. He understood that the greatest potential for growth and loyalty lies in the people society has discarded. If you want to build a team that will walk through fire for you, you don't do it by asserting dominance. You do it by validating their humanity. When you include the excluded, you unlock a reservoir of talent and gratitude that the establishment ignores. Furthermore, we must analyze his resilience. The concept of the Messiah in the Jewish tradition was typically associated with a conquering king, a Davidic warrior who would drive out the pagans. Jesus completely subverted this expectation. He spoke of a kingdom that was not of this world. This confused even his closest advisors. Later, movements like Gnosticism would try to turn this into secret, esoteric knowledge, claiming Jesus was offering a hidden code for a select few. But the historical reality is much more gritty. His secret was that power doesn't come from coercion, it comes from service. This is the logic of the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the meek. Turn the other cheek. Let's decode turn the other cheek. We often interpret this as passivity, a doormat philosophy. But historically, a backhanded slap was the way a superior hit an inferior, a master hitting a slave. To turn the other cheek meant you forced the aggressor to hit you with an open palm or a fist, as an equal. It was an act of non-violent defiance. It was a way of saying, I refuse to be humiliated. You will deal with me as a human being. This is high-level emotional intelligence. It's about regulating your reaction to seize control of the interaction. When you react with anger, you are being controlled. When you react with calculated non-compliance, you retain your agency. In negotiation, in conflict resolution, the person who remains calmest, the person who refuses to mirror the aggression of the opponent, is the one who holds the power. Jesus was also a master of the long game. He knew his message would result in his death. He predicted it. In a world obsessed with survival, he prioritized purpose over preservation. The scholars at Qumran hid their scrolls in jars to preserve their truth. Jesus entrusted his truth to people, flawed, uneducated, erratic people. He bet on human capital. This is a lesson in delegation and trust. He didn't write a book, he built a culture. He spent 3 years pouring his life into 12 guys who didn't really get it half the time. That requires patience. It requires a belief that the seed is more powerful than the sword. When we look at the Sanhedrin, we see the trap of institutional preservation. They were so focused on saving the temple and the nation from Roman wrath that they missed the very point of their faith. They sacrificed integrity for security. Jesus argued that security without integrity is a graveyard. He challenged the legalism of his day. The Pharisees were obsessed with the letter of the law, the forensics of religious observance. Jesus was obsessed with the intent of the law. He healed on the Sabbath. When challenged, he asked, "Is the Sabbath made for man, or man for the Sabbath?" This is a critical question for any leader. Are your systems serving your people, or are your people serving your systems? Organizations often become paralyzed by their own bureaucracy. We create rules to ensure quality, and eventually, the rules prevent the very work they were meant to support. Jesus was the ultimate red tape cutter. He was willing to break a protocol to save a person. That is the definition of ethical leadership. It's knowing when the rule book has become an obstacle to the good. Let's synthesize this. We are looking at a man who had no money, no army, and no political office. Yet, he is the central figure of history. How? Because he mastered the art of the argument. He argued that weakness is strength. He argued that giving is receiving. He argued that the leader is the servant. This is the third way. It is not flight, and it is not fight. It is creative resistance. It is the ability to stand in the tension of opposites and create a new path forward. In your life, you will face the Sanhedrin, the critics, the gatekeepers, the people who say, "We've always done it this way." You will face the Rome, the overwhelming external pressures that threaten to crush you. You might be tempted to run to Qumran, to hide and protect what you have. Don't stand in the market. Speak your truth. Engage with the people no one else sees. When they demand a binary choice, create a third option. When they strike you, refuse to be diminished. The argument Jesus presents to history is that the human spirit, aligned with truth and stripped of ego, is the most powerful force in the universe. It is a logic that defies physics. It is the logic of the seed that must die to grow. So, as you navigate your own leadership journey, ask yourself, are you building a kingdom of walls or a kingdom of tables? Are you protecting your status or are you washing feet? The data shows that walls eventually fall. But the table? The table remains. That is the legacy of the radical thinker from Nazareth. Imagine standing in the dust of first-century Judea. It is hot, it is lateral, and it is crushed under the iron boot of the... This concept of Roman peace is a geopolitical euphemism. In reality, it is a brutal, enforced order maintained by legions who view the local population as a resource to be extracted. In this pressure cooker, you have a fragmented society. You have the collaborators in the temple hierarchy, the withdrawers hiding in the caves of Qumran, and the violent revolutionaries sharpening knives in the alleyways. Into this fractured landscape walks a construction worker from a backwater village called Nazareth. He possesses no political office, no military rank, and no wealth. Yet, within 3 years, he creates a movement that outlasts the empire that executed him. If we strip away the stained glass and the centuries of dogma and look at Jesus purely through the lens of history and leadership dynamics, we find a master communicator operating with a level of emotional intelligence, EQ, that is startlingly modern. We often think of history's great leaders as conquerors. Alexander Great conquered with the spear, Caesar with the legion, Jesus conquered with the question. This is our first major data point. When we analyze the synoptic accounts, Jesus is asked 183 questions. He answers only 3 of them directly. Instead, he asks 307 questions back. This is not avoidance. This is a strategic pedagogical method. It is the Socratic method weaponized for spiritual and social transformation. Consider the strategic thinking here. When you give someone an answer, you give them a fact. When you ask someone a question, you force them to think. You invite them into the architecture of the solution. Jesus spoke Aramaic, the gritty, guttural language of the street, not the polished Greek of the academy. He used this language to tell parables, Trojan horses that bypassed people's intellectual defenses and struck directly at their value systems. Here is the, in your own leadership, in your negotiation, stop trying to win the argument with loom or data dumps. Start asking the questions that force your opponent to examine their own premises. True influence is not about asserting authority. It is about guiding discovery. Now let's zoom in on the specific mechanism of his influence, particularly regarding the concept of judgment and inclusion. We need to talk about the incident with the woman caught in adultery. Historically, this is one of the most high-stakes moments in his biography. The religious elite, members of the wider Sanhedrin influence, drag a woman before him. She has been caught in the act. The law of Moses, the constitution of their people, mandates execution. This is a binary trap. If Jesus says, "Let her go," he is a heretic who despises the law. If he says, "Stone her," he is a rebel against Rome, because under the Yai Choi, the Jewish courts had lost the right to capital punishment. Only Rome could kill. It is a perfect checkmate. Watch what he does. He ignores the binary. He stoops down and writes in the dust. We don't know what he wrote. Some scholars speculate he was listing the sins of the accusers. Others suggest he was simply buying time. From a psychological perspective, he is breaking the OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, act of the mob. He lowers the temperature by lowering his physical posture. He disrupts the frantic energy of the crowd with silence. Then he stands and delivers a single sentence that reframes the entire ethical landscape. Let him who is without sin cast the first stone. He does not condone the act of adultery. He does not say the law doesn't matter. Instead, he deuces a radical new metric for judgment: integrity. He forces the judges to judge themselves before they judge the accused. One by one, starting with the eldest, those with the most history and perhaps the most secrets, they drop their rocks and leave. This brings us to the core moral lesson: complex forgiveness and critical thinking. In our modern context, we are addicted to the gotcha moment. We live in a cancel culture that operates very much like that mob: binary, swift, and merciless. We categorize people as entirely good or entirely evil based on single data points. Jesus demonstrates that critical thinking requires us to hold 2 opposing truths simultaneously. Standards matter, but people matter more. He separates the person from the event. He saves the woman's life, but he also creates an exit ramp for her accusers to save their own dignity. He didn't humiliate them, he let them walk away. That is strategic de-escalation. The practical wisdom here is profound. When you are in a conflict, your goal should not be to destroy the opposition, It should be to dismantle the hypocrisy that fuels the conflict. Forgiveness is not a soft emotion. It is a rigorous intellectual discipline. It requires you to see the systemic context, the human frailty, and the potential for redemption in everyone, even your enemies. This connects directly to his strategy of social inclusion. In the 1st century, the Essenes at Qumran believed in purity through isolation. They withdrew to the desert to wait for the apocalypse. The later Gnosticism movements would seek salvation through secret, elite knowledge. Jesus rejected both. He practiced radical commensality, eating with the wrong people. Tax collectors, zealots, sex workers, Roman centurions. He built a coalition of the incompatible. Why does this matter to us? Because innovation happens at the intersection of differences. If your boardroom, your social circle, or your news feed looks exactly like you are in an echo chamber, not a leadership position. Jesus showed that integrity is not fragile. It doesn't need to be protected in a hermetically sealed environment. True integrity is resilient. It can sit at the table with corruption and not be corrupted. This resilience creates a threat to established power. When you include the excluded, you destabilize the hierarchy. The Sanhedrin did not arrest Jesus because he was a nice man teaching people to be kind. They arrested him because his version of inclusion threatened their monopoly on righteousness. As we look at his trial, we see the ultimate display of internal fortitude. Faced with the power of the state, he creates a deafening silence. He refuses to play the game of power politics. He knows that his integrity is not derived from the verdict of a court, but from his alignment with truth. So, how do we apply the lessons of the Nazarene today? First, embrace the power of the question over the power of the command. Be a master communicator who invites people to think, rather than telling them what to think. Second, practice complex forgiveness. When you see a moral failure, do not rush to stone the perpetrator. Pause, write in the dust, interrogate your own biases. Ask yourself what systemic pressures are at play. Judging without prejudice doesn't mean having no standards. It means having standards that apply to you as strictly as they apply to others. Finally, pursue radical social inclusion. Step out of your ideological bunkers. Eat with the tax collectors of your era, the people you are told to despise. It is in those uncomfortable, gritty human intersections that real growth happens. Jesus of Nazareth changed the world not by conquering it, but by reimagining how human beings relate to one another. He shifted the paradigm from transaction to transformation, from law to love, and from judgment to empathy. In a world that is increasingly polarized, binary, and unforgiving, his methodology isn't just religious history. It is the ultimate masterclass in how to be human. Step into the dust of 1st century Galilee. The air is thick with the tension of a peace enforced by the sword, where the average life expectancy hovers around 35. In this era, survival usually meant keeping your head down. Yet, Jesus of Nazareth, speaking the common Aramaic tongue, chose a path of high-stakes disruption. To understand his impact, we must analyze him not just as a religious icon, but as a master strategist operating with profound emotional intelligence. While the Essenes at Qumran isolated themselves in the desert to preserve their purity, and the Sanhedrin leveraged legalism to maintain political stability, Jesus deployed a radical technology: social inclusion. He understood that true influence isn't gained by fortifying boundaries, but by crossing them. This requires immense resilience and the integrity to stand alone against the mob. Analyze his communication style. He rarely gave direct answers to entrapment questions. Instead, he used parables, data compression, to bypass his listeners' defensive logic. While later movements like Gnosticism would claim wisdom was for an elite few with secret knowledge, Jesus democratized insight, creating an open-source movement accessible to fishermen, women, and tax collectors alike. He recognized that the most resilient organizations are not hierarchies of power, but networks of trust. Here is the mental shift for your own growth. Jesus dismantled the us versus them cognitive bias. In the 1st century, the divide between Jew and Samaritan was absolute. When Jesus framed a Samaritan as the hero of his most famous story, he wasn't just offering a moral platitude. He was hacking the social hierarchy. He forced his audience to recognize value in the very place they were conditioned to see a threat. The is this. Audit your echo chamber. We all have our Samaritans, people, departments, or ideologies we instinctively dismiss. Strategic thinking demands you look there first. True innovation often lies in the friction between opposing worldviews. To lead like a master, you must have the EQ to sit at the table with those who contradict you, effectively breaking the bias that says, comfort equals truth. Growth happens the moment you realize your enemy might hold the missing piece of your solution. When we examine the forensic evidence, we see a construction worker from Nazareth who spoke Aramaic and walked the dust of a minor province, yet somehow managed to dismantle the rigid hierarchies of the Sanhedrin and outlast the iron grip of the Pax Romana. This goes beyond theology. This is a masterclass in strategic resilience and radical social inclusion. Jesus didn't build a physical monument. He built a movement based on the highest form of emotional intelligence, the understanding that true power is not imposed by the sword, but served by the towel. Here is your. History teaches us that systems of control eventually fracture, but influence born of integrity endures. Whether you analyze the texts through the strict laws of the Torah, the asceticism of Qumran, or the abstract metaphors of Gnosticism, the leadership lesson is constant. He challenged us to dismantle our own egos to create space for the marginalized. So, as you walk out of here, I leave you with this question. Are you building an empire that requires walls, or a kingdom that builds tables?